Welcome to part 2 of the online component of session 1 of the observation and feedback course. Today, we're going to be focusing on literal note-taking and the CSI strategy for providing written feedback. So first, literal notes. Many of you are probably familiar with literal notes, but because they're such an important part of providing high quality feedback, we want to make sure we review it and try to push your practice further. So what are literal notes? Some people would describe them as transcription, when you take speech that you hear and you put it into text. And literal notes are evidence. So why are literal notes so important? When we're talking with a teacher or giving written feedback to a teacher, all of the evidence that we use to make any kind of judgment needs to be literal, and it needs to be what we saw or heard in the classroom, because otherwise it could be based on bias, which we're trying to avoid. Another important thing is the discussion we have with a teacher should be grounded in evidence and not in judgment. So Charlotte Danielson, who does a lot of work on teacher evaluations, says there are 3 types of evidence. Words spoken by the teacher or students, such as, can anyone think of another idea? Actions, such as, the students took 45 seconds to line up by the door. And the appearance of the classroom, such as, backpacks are strewn in the middle of the floor. So something you might have noticed as I read this quote from Charlotte Danielson is that the word strewn might have a negative connotation. So I think that this evidence could be improved by using a verb that has a more neutral connotation rather than strewn. So clicking to the next slide here, we're going to think about what are the differences between evidence and opinions. So evidence is really observable, it's objective, free of value judgment, and not subject to debate. So if you look here on this side, you can see some examples of evidence. Just take a minute to read those. Okay, now looking in the right-hand column, opinion. In opinions where you're drawing conclusions, it's subjective, you're making a value judgment, or you're making an inference. So take a minute to read the 3 examples of opinion. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So we're going to jump right into this, and before we do, I just want to make sure you know that the observation and feedback course is really meant to be a space for your learning. And if you were able to write perfect literal notes, write perfect feedback to a teacher, as if there is perfection in either of these things, but if you were able to do that already, then this course wouldn't really be valuable to you. So I want you to know that we don't expect, and we're not even aiming for, perfection in this. I want you to try to just be gentle with yourself, and the whole purpose of this course is to learn how to do better work. So we're going to ask you today to write literal notes and to try out the CSI strategy. You're not going to have to submit those, but we're going to ask you to bring them to our first class on May 20th. So for now, we're going to start with Lauren's classroom. So if you could prepare to write literal notes, you can either do this in your notebook, on a piece of paper, on your laptop. If you do it on your laptop, you'll need to figure out how to get the video on part of your screen and then your note-taking document in another part of the screen. So you'll probably need to pause Edpuzzle to click into our blended slide deck so that you can click on the video link. So you can pause that now, watch the video, write literal notes. You're welcome to watch the video more than once if you didn't feel happy with the notes that you got the first time, but you really don't need to. You can just bring the literal notes that you wrote because the only purpose of it is to get feedback from colleagues during the first class. So welcome back. I hope you enjoyed Lauren's video. So you should have your literal notes from that video. We're going to switch gears into the CSI strategy, and then you'll use your literal notes to try writing a CSI. So when we developed the CSI strategy with the new Teacher Center, they call it content, strategy, and impact, but we often think of it as context, strategy, and impact. So here's how it works. With the C, you try to provide a context for the feedback by describing the objective, activity, lesson, or class observed. And then for S, in this case, you're trying to highlight an effective strategy. So you state the effective instructional strategy that was observed, and you can include some specific supporting evidence. And then impact. And this is such an important part of the CSI because you're not trying to just highlight a strategy that you like, right? You're trying to highlight a strategy that had a positive impact on student learning. So in the impact part of the CSI, you're going to give details that point out the impact of the effective practice you cited about the students and their learning. Okay, so you're trying to see what was the impact on students. So here's an example, and this is not about Lauren's class. This was a 6th grade teacher's class. So take a minute to read this example of a CSI. Okay, and you'll also see that in the impact statement, I connected it to the rubric. So I cited the element number there. Okay, so what might this look like in EDFS? And I know, we're in the middle of transitioning to TeachPoint. So this will be updated so you can think about what this would look like in TeachPoint. But for now, how would we enter this into EDFS? So often I put the context and strategy in the evidence box, and then I put the impact with the link to the rubric into the feedback box. Now you'll see here it says next steps, and in the next session we'll be covering how to write a critical CSI. So not in May, but we'll be working on that in June. And so we're not going to talk about that today, but if it were a critical CSI, you'd be wanting to provide some next steps. So one thing that sometimes confuses people is you're putting the impact in the feedback box, but the impact is evidence-based, right? So a good impact statement has specific evidence about what you saw students doing that was the impact of something the teacher did, right? So it is still evidence-based even if it's in the feedback box. All right, so now we're going to ask you to try this out. So what we would love for you to do is write one CSI about Lauren's class. So since we haven't reviewed how to write a critical CSI yet, try to identify a strategy Lauren used that led to a positive impact on students. And we're going to ask you to bring your literal notes and this CSI to class on May 20th. And we'd like you to bring a hard copy, so either handwritten is fine or printed and typed is fine. In Edpuzzle, you don't need to submit your literal notes or your CSI. What we'd love for you to submit is at least one question you have about writing literal notes or about CSIs or about both, if you have questions about both. Okay? And thank you. This is the end of this session, and look forward to seeing you in the next one.